All right, folks, we're back here on the MCU Rewatch Reviews series with none other than Chris Mueller, the Doc himself. Today we're talking The Incredible Hulk from 2008, only a month out from the Iron Man movie that came out in May of 2008. We had The Incredible Hulk the very next month, something I think a lot of people forget about. Chris, we're talking the Hulk here today, and we go from Iron Man to one of the... I mean, we talked a little bit about it yesterday, where we have one of the highest regarded Marvel movies in the MCU to the Hulk. And I assume you saw both when they came out in theaters 12 years ago. You know, what was the biggest difference you felt between the two movies when they came out?
I mean, the Hulk felt way more like a traditional standard superhero story to me. I was glad they left out the origin story of how he got the powers and sort of focused on everything after that. But yeah, it felt very paint by numbers kind of.
So when I was rewatching this just yesterday, and I completely forgot most of this movie, that the guy from Modern Family was in the movie. What's his name? Ty Burrell.
Yeah.
I forgot that he was in the movie. I totally forgot that not only was that he in the movie, that he was like, was he the boyfriend of Betty, or was he like just a close friend that cared about her? Was that ever established at any point during this movie? I was kind of confused by that.
Yeah, I think they lived together.
Okay. So then I'm going to go all over the place here because I have just so many questions about this movie. So he calls Thunderbolt Ross on Hulk after he escapes, and they have the first part of the movie was a little confusing for me, and then once they started to find the rhythm after they went back after him on the college campus, whatever, then I kind of got into it a little bit more. But he was the one who told them where the Hulk was, where Bruce Banner was, and then Betty was there as well. And then we don't see him after that. We see him talking to Thunderbolt Ross, but that was the only other time we saw him in this movie. Was it ever explained what happened to him?
No, I think it's just sort of assumed that... Doesn't he show up during the big fight, like when Betty's in danger or something?
Yeah, on the campus. Then I think that's it. I don't think we see him again after that for the next hour of the movie. I was like...
I mean, he's, an unimportant character. He's just sort of there to indicate that, like, she had sort of moved on with her life, but then wasn't ready once he came back.
Yeah, that's probably what the only purpose that he served was. I just really kind of forgot about that completely. But going back to the Hulk himself, Edward Norton, this is the only appearance that he makes as the Hulk in the MCU. It's kind of like, in so many words, to put it bluntly, it's pretty much like the forgotten movie of the MCU. You mentioned it yesterday, how with the Hulk, it's a movie that Marvel seems to want to forget and that we have very few references to. We never see Betty Ross again. The only character, I mean, obviously, aside from the Hulk, but we just don't see Norton again, is Thunderbolt Ross. He's the only recurring character in the MCU after this, and he's still very much in the MCU up until now. He was in Civil War. He was in Infinity War. I think he was in Infinity War, and then he makes a quick cameo in Endgame as well. But that's about it. Why do you think this is one of those movies that people completely forget exists?
Well, for one, it was probably wise for them to ignore it, considering they had a different actor playing Hulk moving forward. Because if you bring Edward Norton back, then people are going to be like, well, what about Liv Tyler's character? If it's Mark Ruffalo playing the Hulk, you don't really think too much about that character. But it was also a Universal Studios movie, which that's in part why we haven't gotten another Hulk movie yet, is because there's still rights issues with Universal having the right to make solo Hulk movies. That's why Marvel kind of had to make, like, Thor sort of a backdoor Hulk movie as well, because they can't make just a standalone Hulk movie, to my knowledge.
Do you think that there's a chance we might ever see another one? Because I know there were reports a couple of months ago, maybe in like earlier this year, late last year, that I think they either acquired the rights to Hulk or they were working together again to make another movie. Have you heard anything about that?
I'm not sure. No, I haven't. I don't know what's going on with it. I just know that their plan was to sort of tell a Hulk story across Thor 3 and then the two Avengers movies that followed, and that's why he was sort of going through all these changes between them, because that would have normally been its own movie, that Planet Hulk storyline where he becomes like a gladiator is a whole big thing in the comics.
So With the Marvel, you mentioned it when we were reviewing Iron Man. This is where the timeline seems like weird for me. So Disney buys Marvel in 2009, August of 2009 to be specific. Obviously, Iron Man 2 came out the subsequent year in May of 2010. Thor didn't come out for another year after that. Now we have like a Marvel movies, we have like 3 or 4 a year at this point, so it kind of feels weird that we had none in 2009 and then just one in 2010. But in 2008, so we had Iron Man. The very next month, I assume Iron Man was probably still in theaters when Hulk came out. You see, I'm all over the place here, but you see Tony Stark in the post-credit scene to set up, or further rather, the Avengers Initiative storyline to set up the Avengers a couple of years later. Did they always plan on not releasing another Marvel movie until 2010? Because it seems really odd to me that they would have 2 MCU movies that, I don't know if they knew that at that point, that what it would become, of course, back to back, literally May and then June, and then nothing for another 2 years.
I think it comes down to just when when Disney bought Marvel, they sort of said, like, okay, these 2 movies already exist. What do we want to do from here? And it took time for them to lay out what they wanted to do leading to the Avengers. Then they had to write, screenwriters and all that. All that stuff takes time. So once that company got bought out, it was kind of like a reset, sort of.
Do you think this movie for The Incredible Hulk deserves as much flack as it gets for being one of the weaker MCU films?
I mean, it definitely is one of the weaker MCU films, but I think, again, that comes from the fact that comic book movies were only just starting to be taken seriously, but there were still things you had to do in order to make it kind of cartoony. Like, nowadays, you can take stuff much more seriously, but back then they're like, this is still kind of for kids, so we gotta, make certain things just easy to understand. It's not a very good screenplay, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. And I think Edward Norton has a reputation for, like, coming in and messing with productions and rewriting scenes, and I think that may have happened with this movie.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That was my next question for you. So I was kind of reading up a bit on it. And I know really, really very little about the Hulk prior to watching it again yesterday. It had just been so long. And I mean, there's a lot that I didn't know that went on behind the scenes back in 2008 in regards to this movie. Specifically how I guess Norton played a pretty big role, I guess, in either writing the screenplay or wanting to change it. They didn't want to go with his changes, which I guess played a factor in him leaving and not reprising the role for the Avengers movie a couple of years later. Do you think that had his final edit of the movie made screen, it would have made the movie better or worse?
I don't know. I can't say for sure. I know he didn't, like, step in and start directing the movie, but he always rewrites little bits of dialogue, or he wants to try different things. And Edward Norton is sort of like one of the last of the old school actors where, he takes it very, very seriously and almost too seriously sometimes, which is why it was surprising to hear he even took this role to begin with. Because he's kind of an artsy sort of actor. You expect to see him show up in Spike Lee movies, not Marvel movies.
Well, it seemed like an odd fit. So kind of on the subject of that, how did you think that he played the role of Bruce Banner in this film? Was it as good as Mark Ruffalo, better than Mark Ruffalo?
I mean, it almost feels like 2 different interpretations of the character. Because by the time you get to Mark Ruffalo, he has way more control over being the Hulk than Edward Norton ever did. So, I mean, yeah, it's almost like this movie is separate from the MCU, except for Thunderbolt Ross.
That's the only connection.
Yeah. It's weird. Strange. I don't know.
And another thing,
I wouldn't mind if Liv Tyler came back, honestly. I like her as an actress, so it'd be interesting if they actually had her interact with Mark Ruffalo's character at some point.
Well, that's what I was wondering. So, again, that's another big question. I haven't seen this in forever, so I completely forgot, what happened to her? I know the directors of Infinity War confirmed a couple of years ago when they were saying, who got snapped away, who didn't get snapped away. They said that she died. Not that it even really matters. I mean, obviously she got brought back after Endgame. Not that it really matters because we have never seen her since then. I don't think that was her choice where she didn't want to re-sign on to do the role or whatever. Like even Jane Foster, God, what's her name? Natalie Portman with the Thor movies. Even she was brought back for the second movie, and she's coming back now. I mean, that was the second one came out in 2013, I think, and she's going to be back for the next one almost literally a decade later. So do you think there's any chance that we see Liv Tyler's character again as Betty Ross, or do you think that's completely written away and we'll never see her again?
It'd be a fun cameo. I don't ever see her being an important character in any of the future movies because they already make it seem like the Hulk has moved on romantically, and now he's like the Hulk full time. So who even knows if he can be with a woman? But it is what it is. It's not important if she ever returns, and if she does, it'll just be a nice nod to the previous movie.
Do you think if there was another Hulk movie at some point, which again at this point doesn't look too likely, they already have their slate set of the next, God, I don't know, 10 Marvel movies it seems like for the next number of years. If another Hulk movie was made, even though it's going to be 15 years after this movie was made, any chance we see some sort of I was going to say a Black Widow Betty Ross storyline where they're fighting for the Hulk, but I guess Black Widow died after Infinity War, so we're not going to see that. But it just seems strange. Like, was it just me, or did they not really finalize the fact that they broke up, so to speak, at the end of this movie? They just kind of went their separate ways, and that was it. They never really said, oh, we're done. Like, even with Jane Foster and Thor, I mean, it took a number of years, but in Infinity War, they said, oh, she dumped him or vice versa, whatever. But there was never any acknowledgement, again, as far as I know, in terms of the relationship between Betty and Hulk.
No, not really. I mean, even the few scenes Thunderbolt Ross has, he doesn't bring it up. So it feels like she's sort of a sacrifice of them making this a different version of the Hulk almost. And if they were ever going to do another Hulk movie within the MCU, it would be one of the other Hulks from the comics.
How do you think this one compared, if you've seen it, and I assume you have, to the 2003 Hulk movie that came out about 5 years prior to this one?
The 2003 one was kind of a mess. I didn't care for it at all. It felt like three different movies at times, and that was, still very early in the days of big budget superhero stuff. So it was a weird choice to get Ang Lee to direct it to begin with. I mean, there were some cool looking scenes in it, but it didn't feel like the comic book Hulk to me. And that's what was weird about this movie is like the fact that they skipped over how he became the Hulk almost made you wonder in the beginning, like, is this a sequel to the old Hulk movie or is it supposed to be its own thing? Like, they weren't very clear on that. So once he gets to Betty Ross's character, you're like, oh, okay, it's definitely a different one. But yeah, it was a little weird telling whether or not this was a sequel to the first one or not when you first start watching it.
That's what I'm saying. So, like, with the beginning, I was so confused, and I just want to see if this is made, because they do the flashbacks. Literally, the first thing that you see in this movie are the flashbacks to him with Betty, and then Thunderbolt Ross when the whole accident happened. I had to look it up to make sure I knew what I was watching here and what was going on, because I was so confused, because it literally all happens within the span of maybe a couple of minutes, and not even 5 minutes, which is the whole flashback scene and everything else. What were your thoughts in the opening in this movie? Was it a mess just for me, or was it like, what were your thoughts on it?
It was weird. I think what they were trying to do was catch you up on the Hulk's story really quickly without alienating the people who already knew his story, but it might not have worked so well.
Is that a recurring theme, you think? Because we talked about when we reviewed Iron Man about how with Spider-Man, they don't really get into the Uncle Ben storyline at all, and I like that, because, I mean, we've seen so many Spider-Man movies over the years. I know there was a Hulk movie, of course, like we just said, 5 years before this, in 2003, where they went into that whole thing. But do you think that's kind of a Marvel move, a Marvel theme or whatever, where it's their decision to kind of X out the backstories of certain comic book characters where they kind of assume that people going to see this movie already know what's going on?
I mean, with Spider-Man, yeah. It's like we've already had two versions of Spider-Man. So, two in the screen. There was a live-action TV show back in the day that nobody remembers. But, it is what it is. It's basically them saying, like, you know what's going on with these characters. We don't need to keep re-showing the same thing and shoving it down your throats. You know Uncle Ben's dead. With the Hulk, it's like, yeah, you know he got exposed to radiation. He's the Hulk.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was smart for them to skip over that part because it was not necessary, especially after we had just gotten a Hulk movie 5 years earlier where all they focused on was how he became the Hulk.
Did you like the fact that in this movie they kind of built up to that one scene where, again, they were on the campus, I believe that's where they were, where that's where Betty was and Thunderbolt Ross, and they let the whole kind of let out the cavalry on the Hulk to kind of tame him and whatever. That was the first, I believe, aside from the opening, but you don't actually see it. You see it from his perspective. Did you like the fact that they built up to the first appearance of the Hulk in the movie?
Yeah, I mean, in that scene down in Brazil or wherever he is at the bottling plant where you just kind of see him in the shadows, like that was a good way to sort of introduce him before showing him fully on screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, it was definitely a good idea on their part to keep that sort of in the dark at the beginning, just so the first time you see him, it's in broad daylight.
Was the only thing he said as the Hulk in the movie Hulk Smash at the end, was that the only thing he said as the Hulk?
No, at one point he screams, "Leave me alone."
Was that before or after?
I can't remember who he yells that at, but I know that it's like he screams that, and I think he actually says Betty at one point too.
Really? That's surprising, because he's silent for most. I'm trying to think, because I know there's been a lot of discussion over the years, specifically when it comes to Ragnarok, about how much he talks and whatever, and how it's just not true to the Hulk character, because he says so few lines in this movie and in Avengers and other movies that he appears in before Ragnarok. Did you like overall how they portrayed the Hulk in this film?
Yeah, I mean, it was classic Hulk. He's not supposed to be a talkative character to begin with. What they did in Thor, they did out of necessity, and the fact that, like, plenty of comics and cartoons have shown the Hulk gaining the ability to speak and form thoughts and stuff, so it's not that out of the realm of what they've already done. But yeah, I felt like in this movie, if they had portrayed him as being, like, way more in control of being the Hulk, it wouldn't have been as interesting. It was good to see them take their time before Bruce Banner got to that point.
And there has been an argument in recent years where with Norton, where I think Ruffalo has, people have argued that Ruffalo has the better Bruce Banner of the two, which I would agree with, but this Hulk is better than the Hulk that we would see in future installments. I mean, obviously, we'll get into the animation in a second, but in terms of how they portray the Hulk and, I don't know, just in recent years, not that it's a bad thing, as I enjoy it personally, how they've kind of made it out to be a comedy character with some of the scenes that he's had in, Infinity War and specifically Endgame and obviously Ragnarok as well. Do you think they've kind of lost their way with the Hulk character, or do you think it's just kind of their way of evolving it so it's not as one-dimensional?
Well, yeah, I think they have to do something different with him occasionally, or it's just going to be, it's not fun to watch the same big green guy go smash stuff every time. The fact that they made him more of an amalgamation of the Hulk and Banner now, I think, is an interesting way to take it. And I do hope there's more of him in the future movies, because I'm curious to see what they would do with him going forward.
Yeah, especially after the last time that we saw him in Endgame. It seems like he's had this complete character arc, and the death of Black Widow, of course, and Infinity War, to see how that affects him, the sacrifice that he took at the end of Endgame. So it'd be cool to see what more they do with him moving forward. I mean, a bit of a side note, but do you know what Mark Ruffalo's status is? Like, how many more movies he has left as the Hulk?
I'm not really sure. I think he is slated to be in something coming up. I'm just not sure what it would be.
Yeah, maybe it might be another, I don't want to say Avengers team-up movie, because that's not going to be for another number of years down the road. But, yeah, I know he's not done yet. Like, obviously, Captain America's done, Tony Stark's done. Doesn't seem like the Hulk was written off in any major form or fashion in Endgame. So, obviously, we will see him again. It's just a matter of in what form or fashion. But in the beginning of this, you mentioned the budget for this movie, too. It had a $150 million budget. And, I mean, at least for me, I thought the animation for the Hulk, and maybe it was groundbreaking at the time, so maybe you can shine some more light on this, having seen it when it came out 12 years ago. I just thought it looked completely ridiculous, especially compared to what we were talking about with the Iron Man review, how realistic that movie kind of seemed and looked and everything else. no corny, not many corny scenes with like unrealistic stuff, typical superhero movie stuff. It seems like we got a lot of that in this movie. Were you in favor of it or were you against it? And in terms specifically of the animation and how Hulk looked and whatever.
I mean, at the time, it was groundbreaking animation, and they've gotten better at it since, but that's just how visual effects are. I mean, you go back and watch any movie from more than 10 years ago, and you're going to see how bad some things look in comparison, but at the time, it didn't look bad. It's like, did you ever see the original Jumanji movie with Robin Williams?
Yes, I have. Yeah, some of the animation.
That's one of the greatest examples I like to cite of, like, at the time, people were like, oh my God, there's monkeys on the same screen as real people, blah, 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 or this lion or whatever. And it's like, yeah, now it looks like a bad video game cutscene, but back then that was what they had to work with. And we're still seeing big advances in visual technology. Like, the amount of visual effects that goes into some things that people don't even realize are visual effects is staggering.
It's crazy, and maybe just because for me, because with Jumanji, that came out in the 90s? I want to say it came out in the mid-90s, 95 or 96 or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's like you watch the movie, it's like, oh, okay, it came out in the 90s, 80s, whatever. Like, you would expect the animation to be what it is. Maybe it's just because it's a weird time when this came out in the 2000s and 2008 where I expect it to be a lot better or closer to today just because, I mean, it is a while ago. It was 12 years ago. But I guess I assume, or I just automatically assume it's going to be what it is today, and it's just not because Hulk looks so drastically different in terms of how they present him and the animation and everything else. I didn't think it looked terrible, but it definitely is a drastic difference compared to what we have now. But not just, I think the Hulk overall came across fairly well, I thought, as we discussed. Wasn't a big Betty fan. I thought Liv Tyler did a good job, but her character didn't really seem, not that she didn't have any redeeming qualities, but she didn't really have anything to me that was like, oh, she's such a great secondary character or a love interest for Bruce Banner. I thought, Jane Foster and Thor, which we'll get to at some point, was kind of, she had more personality with her character, that being Natalie Portman. But I thought the bad guys in this movie were interesting too. Thunderbolt Ross, we know now, as kind of being on the side of the Avengers and putting in the Sokovia Accords, however you pronounce it, a couple of years ago with Ultron and whatever. How do you think he was? How do you think Thunderbolt Ross was as the main villain for most of this movie up until the end, anyway?
Well, I like that they had him tread the line between being a jerk and being an outright villain, because he wasn't really a villain. Everything he did for what could reasonably be seen as a good reason. Either he was trying to protect his daughter or he was trying to contain what he saw as a major threat. I mean, his attitude towards the Hulk is exactly the same as Batman's towards Superman and Batman v Superman. Mm-hmm. He's basically like, this guy has way too much destructive power for any one person. We need to contain that. Of course, he does it the wrong way, and that's why he appears to be a villain. But I like the fact that Marvel has sort of kept him as, like, he's part of the military, and he is on the side of the good guys, even if he clashes with them.
Yeah, I like how the fact that it's not night and day. It's not black or white with him, where it's like, oh, he's a full-fledged bad guy as some of the other people in these movies are, or, he went from being a bad guy and he had this change of heart. I mean, it wasn't really until I felt like the turning point with his character in this movie was when they showed Blonsky had to become the Abomination. And then he was like, oh man, what have I done? We're using these, the Hulk, powers, whatever, for evil, whatever. So that was kind of his change of heart, but not to the point where he's like this goody two-shoes character 12 years later. He's still kind of clashing with the Avengers even up until, Infinity War and Endgame and movies like that in recent years. But Abomination, obviously, Blonsky was kind of like the main bad guy. He was like, his right-hand man. He was Thunderbolt's right-hand man for most of the movie before becoming Abomination at the tail end of it. Are you familiar at all with the Abomination comic book character, and how do you think he came across in this movie?
I don't know that much about him from the comics, but I do like Tim Roth and... Not Tim Roth. Was it Tim Roth?
Yeah, Tim Roth, yeah.
Yeah, Tim Roth, okay. I do like the way he did it, where it sort of was like a slow descent into madness. Because when you first see him, like, he's just a very controlled spec ops guy. Mm-hmm. And then his first encounter with the Hulk sort of shakes him a little bit.
Yep.
and then he gets the ability to get a little bit of the Captain America serum or whatever they give him, and from that point forward, he wants more power, and that's why he, makes the one guy give him some of Hulk's blood, because it was it was a good transition, and I actually kind of wish he was a villain that they would almost bring back in some way, because he's a great actor for one, and two, like, who else is Hulk really gonna fight now that Thanos is gone? Like, not a lot of people are on Hulk's level physically.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like, not that he would be up there with the best bad guys in the MCU, but when you have that conversation, you never hear about Abomination. I honestly completely forgot about it until I rewatched the movie before we started doing this. It's just kind of crazy, and he was supposed to be, portrayed as being, outmatching Hulk and just being better than Hulk in almost every way, and he gave him a great fight before, succumbing to defeat at the end of the movie. I am surprised that we haven't seen either more of him or another character like him. It is kind of surprising.
There was one reference to him in the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show where Coulson threatens to punish somebody by making them guard Blonsky's cryo cell. So it's like he's somewhere being held prisoner by the government.
I was going to say, because he didn't die at the end of this movie. They just put him in jail or whatever, right?
Yeah, I know the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. show isn't really so much part of the MCU anymore because they're kind of doing their own thing, but in the first couple seasons, they have this story about how there's a facility up north where they sort of keep everybody and everything that they don't know what to do with. And the stuff that's really dangerous, they kind of shoot into the sun with a rocket. So he's probably at that facility just being held on ice somewhere. They could do so much with that character having so much time passed. Like, they could write it in where, now he has control of his powers, like the Hulk maybe, or maybe he's reformed and he works with the good guys or something. Who knows? But I feel like having Tim Roth in your franchise for only one movie is kind of a mistake.
Aside from Coulson, have they brought back any of the MCU characters? Like you said, they referenced him, but have they brought back any of the MCU characters in the show, or do you think they have plans to, or whatsoever?
Well, right now, the show is going into its last season, which they already filmed.
Oh, okay.
So I doubt it, just because the timelines are always sort of weird, because they film movies and that show at completely different times. And plus, that show, at this point, it sort of stands on its own. It's not really part of the MCU anymore, because so many big events have happened in that show that should have affected the Marvel Universe that don't.
Yeah.
But Lady Sif appeared in a few episodes.
Oh, okay.
So did what's his name, Sitwell. He was in a couple episodes. Oh. Yeah, like leading up, because that show and not Civil War, Winter Soldier.
Yeah.
Like, that Winter Soldier actually affected the show. Like,
I did, yeah. I haven't watched
the destruction of S.H.I.E.L.D. was actually a big part of the end of the first season of that show. So from that point forward, they were sort of operating as their own little mini version of S.H.I.E.L.D. outside of the purview of the government.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Samuel L. Jackson has made a couple of cameos too, but those are the only characters I can think of, other than maybe Peggy Carter in like a flashback.
Huh, interesting. Oh, and then they also have the Peggy Carter show as well. Or Miss Carter, whatever that show is, yeah.
Agent Carter, that only lasted 2 years.
Oh, did it really? Was it just did not do well?
Yeah, it didn't really do well, and it was also, like, you're telling the story of a woman who we know is never in danger of dying because we've already seen her in future movies, so there's not any stakes. Like, it's hard that's what's hard about prequels, is you can't put a character in mortal danger who we know survives and have us care.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, exactly. Because you know that she's not going to die, so why even really bother in investing in certain situations and whatever. But yeah, I remember with the S.H.I.E.L.D. thing, again, I know this is unrelated to what we're talking about, but did they, because the movie came out in April of 2014. I don't follow the show. I want to watch it at some point just to kind of catch up with it. Didn't, like, the very next episode that they aired after the movie came out, was that when everything happened? And they literally timed it perfectly, didn't they?
Yeah, they timed it perfectly. So the episode leading into that, sort of hinted at some things, and then the very next episode literally occurred at the same time as Winter Soldier. So, like, on the screens in some room, you actually see all the helicarriers crashing from the movie as it's happening compared to the show.
That's awesome. It seems like that's unprecedented with sometimes with movies and television in terms of crossovers and whatever. So that's pretty cool. I mean, and then again, Marvel usually does it right. But back to the Hulk, though. Going back to we were talking about Thunderbolt Ross, Abomination. Something I had to ask you about while watching this movie, and I had heard about it recently when someone else was doing a rewatch of the movie as well. When it comes to Samuel Stearns, so he's played by Tim Blake Nelson, who I'm like, oh yeah, I remember him. I've seen him in Holes and movies like that and whatever. And he doesn't play a major part of the movie, but he does kind of come into play towards the end there and helping Hulk, and then kind of working with Abomination, Blonsky, whatever. And then whatever, like you said, the serum or Hulk's blood, whatever, seeps in his head, and it starts moving around, and he was supposed to be the leader. That's a comic book character. I'm not overly familiar with him, but I guess that was the idea behind it, that's what he was supposed to become from that point forward. Obviously, we haven't seen him since, and this was 12 years ago. What are your thoughts on the fact that they haven't brought this character back and the potential that they could use Tim Blake Nelson for in the MCU?
I mean, I think at this point it's probably too late to bring his character in, and Tim Blake Nelson has actually appeared in other comic book movies since this, so clearly he's not under any kind of contractual constraints. He was in the Fantastic Four movie, actually.
Oh, was he really? The remake or the original ones, like 10 years ago?
No, the newer one. He was one of the government guys who, wanted to use the project for the sake of the government.
Oh, interesting. Wasn't he in Watchmen 2, the show?
I have not seen the Watchmen show.
Yeah,
I don't have HBO or any of those, or
okay.
anything with that service.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I had heard that he was in that show, but yeah, no, just with him specifically, because it seemed like it was a pretty, major plot point. Do you think that they were going to revisit that in a second Hulk movie? Because I know...
oh, I'm sure. That was a dangling thread from a sequel that never got made.
Yeah, it seemed like Norton made it sound like in future interviews that this was supposed to be chapter 1, so to speak, of a Hulk story. Kind of like what Thor is when he had the evolution of his character from the first movie to the second, and specifically the third of Ragnarok. Do you think that they had plans for a lot of this? He had mentioned this, or maybe it was... I'd read some interview either with him or with Nelson himself, where he said that there was supposed to be he was supposed to sign on for 3 different movies, and maybe he was supposed to be the big bad for Hulk, kind of like his version of Loki, and it just never happened. Do you think after watching this that there were plans to do more movies before they were scrapped, either because they couldn't work with Universal Studios or because the Marvel thing happened with Disney? What do you think was the reasoning or the logic behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just one of those things that they planted a seed in case they got a sequel, and they didn't, and it just never paid off. I doubt anything will ever come of it at this point, and The Incredible Hulk, like you said, it's sort of the forgotten movie. Marvel just hopes that at this point people don't care if anything from that movie matters in the future, because they've sort of forged their own path with the Hulk going forward.
And obviously one of the biggest parts of the movie comes during the post-credits scene when you see Thunderbolt Ross kind of, downtrodden at a bar or whatever when he's encountered, when Tony Stark walks up and brings up the Avengers Initiative. What were your thoughts watching this? Again, this came out a month after Iron Man. So after watching that, were you like, okay, there's going to be a post-credit scene? Were you spoiled going into it knowing what was going to happen?
That one, I'm trying to remember if I even saw that movie in the theater. I might have seen it once it came out on DVD. Mm-hmm. So it was probably, I think I knew about it already ahead of time.
So with that, were you thinking when you watched it, whether it be again in the theater or on DVD, whatever, where you're like, oh man, this is an actual thing that they're doing. It's not just a throwaway line at the end of Iron Man. They actually are building to an Avengers movie at some point?
I mean, I hoped that's where I was leading, and I knew they'd already announced by that point, I think, plans for at least Captain America, which, that gave me hope too, but I also know that they were filming Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk at roughly the same time, and that's why Downey did that cameo. It was sort of like a favor. because they're like, we're trying to do this thing, it may or may not work, can you just film this quick scene that we'll throw at the end of the movie? And he said sure. So I don't think he was even paid technically for an appearance in the Hulk.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah, because it's like he's not even in the credits.
Oh,
like,
that's what I was going to ask. He's not in the credits, is he?
Yeah, it's a totally uncredited cameo, and the fact that he made probably $50 million for the last Avengers, I think, makes up for doing one free scene.
The one forgotten movie of the MCU. That was the thing. So I got to ask you, you saw Iron Man, and then you don't even remember if you saw it in theaters. And this came out a month after Iron Man. So after looking it up, it says right here in Wikipedia that it grossed $264 million worldwide, making it the lowest grossing film of the MCU. Now, I know there wasn't a lot of hype behind the Hulk and whatever, but don't you think that after Iron Man and the major success that was, it would make people think, oh man, if that movie was good, this Marvel movie must be good too? Why do you think there was such a disconnect there? I mean, again, it's not like it's a couple years later. It was literally the next month. Why do you think it did so poorly at the box office?
I just don't think the Hulk is a character that appeals to everybody. Like, you really have to like a previous version of the Hulk to care about the current Hulk, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So you have people who grew up with the Lou Ferrigno Hulk show, or you have the people who watched the Marvel cartoons in the 90s. Like, they may have some affection for Hulk or readers of the comics, but I don't think the average person watches a trailer for the Hulk and thinks like, oh, that's a movie I have to see.
Do you think not having, I mean, again, they had Robert Downey Jr., who wasn't doing, I mean, he was established by the time that Iron Man came out, but it had been a while since he was in a movie. We already talked about that in our review of that movie. But do you think having Norton as the face of the Hulk franchise early on kind of hurt it at the box office in terms of, okay, we don't really know if Norton being in this movie is going to make it good, or do you think that was kind of a separate factor?
Well, I think he was, I mean, Edward Norton's a recognizable person, and in 2008, he was a bankable star, so I think at that point, putting him in was just like, we have an A-list actor, and we're going to stick him on all the posters. But I think at that point, like, he probably knew he was never going to do another Hulk movie, like, as soon as this one came out.
And you mentioned, too, I was going to bring this up and then I completely forgot, but you mentioned it just there before, about Lou Ferrigno. He made a cameo in this movie as the security guard. He actually has not an extended role, but he has an extended conversation interaction with Edward Norton's Hulk in this movie. It's not like you just see him walking by or like a Stan Lee type cameo. You actually see him, hear him talk and see him for a couple, about 15 seconds or so. What were your thoughts on Lou Ferrigno's appearance in this Hulk movie?
Well, I mean, Lou Ferrigno is the defining Hulk portrayal from the original series, so it's nice that they try to throw him a cameo in some of these things. He actually did the voice of the Hulk in this too.
Oh, did he really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, because he did the voice for like one of the animated cartoons back in the 90s, and so they reached out to him to do it for this too. So that's not Edward Norton talking when it's the Hulk, it's Lou Ferrigno.
Oh, that's awesome. That was that the only movie they did that with him? They didn't use that for the other movies that Hulk was in, right?
I want to say that he had something to do with Thor Ragnarok too. Like, it might have been a layover of him and Ruffalo talking at the same time or something like that. I'm not 100% sure. I just know that he's had more involvement since this movie. I just can't remember what it is. He might have had a cameo in the Avengers now that I think about it.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and check. I remember seeing him in this movie, then I completely forgot whether he was, he continued to be involved in the years after that. Unrelated, but did you see Lou Ferrigno's appearance on AEW Dynamite this week in the Bubbly Bunch cameo video?
Oh yeah, that was funny.
Yeah, I thought that was great. I forgot that I think Jericho is good friends with Lou Ferrigno. I think he was on his podcast at one point because it seemed completely...
It wouldn't surprise me if they knew each other in some way.
Yeah, Jericho has a lot of contacts. I just thought that was cool. But, overall, honestly, watching it back, this wasn't as terrible as I thought it was or as I remember it being. It was a good movie. Definitely pales in comparison to the other ones. Where would you rank this among the many Marvel movies that are part of the MCU? Of the 23, 24 that have come out, where would you put this one?
I mean, it's pretty low down there. It's not a movie that I think I'll ever have a desire to rewatch. Mm-hmm. Like, I could literally rewatch any other Marvel movie right now, and this is the only one I think where I'd probably be like, yeah, I'll skip that.
Yeah, again, just because there's not a lot of things like even the Thor movies, like they're not the most exciting, the first two anyway. But like Dark World, you can kind of, I mean, it would help to watch to kind of help with Endgame. Aside from the gamma radiation reference in Endgame when Hulk said I was made for this and whatever, there's really no need to watch this movie if you already know what the Hulk is capable of, right?
Yeah, and I mean they go into the Avengers kind of going like, you know who the Hulk is and what he's about. We don't need to expand on it much more.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought overall they did a good job with it. Definitely not one of the more must-see movies in the MCU, but it was a fine transitional film before they ushered in Iron Man 2 2 years later, and then they kind of kicked off the entire MCU with that, and Captain America, Thor, and then Avengers a couple years after that. Any final takeaways on The Incredible Hulk from 2008?
Not really. You know, it's one of those bargain bin movies that you see at Walmart for $5 and you still skip past it.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. Well, thankfully, I was happy that this was second, so we can get to kind of like the better ones from here. I have not seen Iron Man 2 in a while, so I'm actually kind of looking forward to seeing that. I know it's not one of the better ones they did, but I'm looking forward to rewatching that. And then I think we established earlier, and then it was Thor, I think that came out in 2011 before that, or after that rather. And then, of course, Captain America, which is a great movie. And then Avengers, which would wrap up Phase 1. But, Chris, this has been awesome. Next time we are talking Iron Man 2, so that should be up next week here on the channel. People can find you on the Twitter machine at @BR_Doctor. Chris, thanks as always, dude. This was great.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Take care, man. I'll talk to you soon.
All right, take it easy.